At dawn on the cool, misty early morning of Saturday the 14th of October, 1066, two huge 7,000-strong armies clashed on Senlac Hill, near Hastings, in a ferocious and merciless bloodbath. The invading Normans, in a hostile country and cut off by the English fleet in the Channel, had to win at all costs. The English needed only to hold firm until dusk, then kill or capture the beaten or starved-out enemy. The outcome would become famous in the following centuries, having decided the future of England, and later the English-speaking world. The main primary source for what happened is the Norman, William of Poitiers, writing closest to the events in the early 1070s. He himself was a former knight, giving him a much deeper insight into warfare than many writers, although his heavy bias is obvious. At the time he was in his 40s, a similar age to both King Harold of England and to his master, Duke William of Normandy, to whom he was serving as chaplain. The army of the fearsome William was divided into three. His own Normans in the centre and his Breton and French allies were to his left and right respectively, assembling in the marshy valley and glaring up the steep slope at the defiant English. Archers were at the front of each sector, behind them the heavily armed infantrymen, then at the back were the much-famed and highly disciplined 2,000 cavalry, as reserves for the rout or for last-ditched breaking of the enemy. They would charge at the enemy in small squadrons, or convoy, hurl or strike with their lances, then tightly wheel around and bolt off, making way for the next unit, and so on until an open gap in the enemy's ranks could be exploited. Even their fierce destrier war horses were trained to bite and kick. But the steep gradient of the hill was against them, negating their speed and draining vital energy. King Harold Godwinson's army, still hurriedly positioning themselves, was along the top of the steep hill, half a mile across, protected by the ancient Andred's wheeled woods on one side and blocking the road to London. It was mostly made up of the fyrd, a part-time army of freemen usually called to defend their shire, or to fight and provide their own weaponry when summoned by the king, as in 1066. Thanes accompanied the king. They were land-holding nobles below earl status, chain-mailed, well-armed and tough. The spearhead and the front line of Harold's army were his much-dreaded and elite professional housecarl warriors who, according to epigraphic sources, were 2,000 to 3,000 strong in England. They and the thanes formed the overlapping defensive shield wall, which would prove to be a formidable obstacle to their enemy. They lived with and were housed, armed, paid and fed by their earl or king. In return, they swore to die for him if required. They wore chainmail, were also heavily armed, and many fought with spears and swords, others with their lethal razor-sharp 6-foot-long, two-handed battle axes. The fearsome reputation of these elite men was well deserved. Swinging their axes in a figure of 8 to gain momentum, they could slice down both horse and rider with just one blow. The grisly scenes in the Bayeux Tapestry are testament to this. Even Norse writer Snorri Sturluson said that just one of these men was worth 2 of King Harald Hardrada's best warriors. Harold himself was in the centre, surrounded by more such bodyguards. His personal banners, the Fighting Man and the Wessex Dragon, fluttered in the cool breeze. Commanding either flank were Harold's younger brothers, Earls Gurth and Leof Wyn, each with their own retinue of housecarls. To the blaring of horns and waving of banners, William ordered his infantry forward uphill. As they neared the waiting English, who were already jeering and chanting out, 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 ferocious storms of missiles and stones rained down at them. Overawed, and with many killed and injured, they reeled back downhill in disarray. The archers' arrows merely hit English shields or harmlessly flew overhead. Housecarl axes sliced deep into enemy flesh amidst the chaos and deafening screams of those cleaved in the brutal hand-to-hand killing. Poitiers described successive waves of William's infantry, archers and cavalry failing to dislodge or wipe out the stubborn defenders. But then, at one crucial point early on in the battle, a larger number of the Bretons than before broke in panic from the bloody fight. savagely repulsed by the sheer ferocity of the English defenders, and fled back downhill in panic. But this time, the fyrd on the English right, overjoyed at seeing their enemy flee, broke their solid formations and chased them downhill, thinking that the battle was won. But the Breton and some Norman cavalry rallied and quickly cut off the impetuous fyrdsmen's retreat. The doomed Englishmen were slaughtered in full view of the exasperated king and their outraged comrades. This is the point in the Bayeux tapestry that shows Englishmen on a small mound surrounded by horsemen away from the main battle lines. Some say that is the Malfosse incident, meaning Evil Ditch, where some rallying English fought back so fiercely as to cause heavy Breton, French and Norman cavalry losses. Others say that the incident was after the battle when surviving housecarls, possibly under fresh leadership, carried on the fight as dusk fell. The Normans later claimed that the cavalry's feigned retreat was a deliberate ruse. Though a well-known tactic on the continent, others accused the Normans of playing down the genuine panic of William's army. Harold was surely forced to quickly take control of this chaotic indiscipline if his army was to survive, or they would face annihilation. Possibly huge numbers of men on the right flank were already committed, and may have unwittingly charged on too far to be able to scramble back uphill. Could they have failed to hear the commands or blaring horns above the noise of battle screams and weapons clanging? Harold had to act fast to ensure that his battle line stayed as one unit. So did he order a general advance of his entire army, a cohesive shield wall of the whole English line to attack downhill and annihilate the panicking enemy? They were now desperately vulnerable in perilous disorder in the marshes and unable to resist a whole-scale English charge at high momentum. Surely this was the perfect moment to strike. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that both of Harold's brothers were killed early on, leading from the front, as noblemen did. Their deaths at this crucial moment, inspiring their charging men, could have been catastrophic, causing a stricken Harold to rapidly counter-command his advance order. Chaos on top of chaos. Losing two senior commanders, the English would then have to halt, retreat or scramble back uphill, likely in utter disarray and stumbling over the dead, dying and slipping on the blood-soaked grass, as men did at the Battle of Flodden in 1513. William's army would also have been too chaotic at this point to take advantage of this sudden reverse, but seeing this serendipitous outcome, from now on William ordered his archers to fire over the English shield wall in a steep trajectory, as well as at their shields. The tapestry shows a few Englishmen fleeing the battle clutching arrow shafts in their faces. Now, all of William's cavalry across his entire line would deliberately feign retreats, in order to tempt yet more English away from their effective shield wall and slaughter them. Amazingly, it worked. We still don't understand what really happened, or why, and apparently was only on the right flank of Harold's army. As housecarls and thegns fighting in the shield wall fell, and gaps started to appear, fyrd's men would have found it easier to break through, though the more disciplined men in front must have angrily tried to block their impetuous comrades. The English shield wall was now desperately trying to close the disturbing gaps before the enemy cavalry could exploit them. But still they held strongly, and neither side was obviously winning or losing. William was personally fighting in the thickest of the battle and had 3 horses killed from beneath him that day, whose apparent death shocked his fighting army, causing many to panic and retreat until he rode amongst them, shouting that he was still alive and berating any of his army for fleeing. As the day grew long, as more men died and as the sun lowered, the integrity of the English shield wall began to disintegrate, and Norman cavalry began to break through. But then, disaster. Harold was struck in the face by one of the arrows, falling and screaming in agony. Men nearest to him thought he was killed. Panic quickly spread, and the fyrd broke and began to flee, or crawl into the forest and die of their wounds. But not the thegns and housecarls. The exhausted warriors were driven on by adrenaline and fired up bloodlust. They fought on feverishly around their stricken king and along the entire ridge line, in small groups or in broken shield wall sections fighting to the death, thus fulfilling their oaths. The battle was now resembling the maelstrom of a poked hornet's nest. But soon, it was all over. The day's butchery was finished and the vengeful rout was in full fury. The flower of England is said to have died there, such was the merciless slaughter. Its sheer ferocity and staggering duration of the fighting shocked contemporaries across Europe, including the Vatican. The length of the violent battle shows that the English were not easily overcome. Most battles of this period lasted for 2 to 3 hours, yet Hastings lasted all day and was evenly fought, according to Poitiers. Ultimately, the fyrd on the right flank had weakened Harold's defense and sabotaged a crucial victory. But is that really accurate? Could the blame on the charging fyrdsmen be a later exaggeration, added with hindsight? The housecarls don't appear to have been complicit in the indisciplined dash forth. We do not know any more about the composition of the Anglo-Saxon fyrd, where the men of each shire had fought, as was their proud tradition since before the days of King Alfred. The Normans and French had also broken in disarray. So what was so different on the right flank that the sources thought it noteworthy? Could it be that many of these Englishmen on the right flank were actually late reinforcements? That they had not been present to hear Harold's strict pre-battle command to hold formation at all costs? We know from primary sources that more fyrdsmen came trickling in from the southern shires throughout the day, as ordered by Harold as he dashed back to London after massacring the Vikings at Stamford Bridge. Were these men marshalled onto the nearest flank, the right side, as they arrived through the Weald Forest as their comrades had earlier? In 1070, the aging Pope, Alexander II, imposed a heavy penance upon King William and any of his soldiers present that day, for what he termed the spilling of Christian blood. Each would, depending upon their actions, pay pence to the church, or do good acts. William built Battle Abbey. Such was the level of bloodshed at the battle, even in that ultra-violent age, Hastings stood out. The headless and mutilated men and horses depicted in the Bayeux tapestry, darned by noble English ladies possibly still grieving their dead, confirmed this. In future years the Normans were desperate to justify their illegitimate duke's succession claim and his savage conquest, fudging a few events here and there, which may not have been beyond them. They certainly strived to label King Harold as a usurper, and to airbrush any mention of him as king out of the sources, even though he was popularly elected by the Witan and a dying king, Edward the Confessor. Author Ian Walker stated in his book, Harold, the Last Anglo-Saxon King, "The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle record has been adjusted at a later date." Emma Mason wrote in her book, House of Godwin, "The Norman claim to the succession to the English throne originated in opportunism and is riddled with inconsistencies." On that dreadful day, the sun didn't just set upon the bodies of a dead king and several thousand brave men, but a whole nation.